Arrogant cop. Throws black pastor out of a community meeting. Then the town council goes silent. The building that housed the Millbrook City Council chambers had been constructed in 1961, when the city had enough civic confidence to put up a proper government building with a real facade and wide front steps and a lobby floor made of cream-colored stone. The council chamber itself was on the second floor, reached by a broad staircase that local custom had kept free of the kind of institutional modifications that make buildings feel like they are apologizing for their own existence. The chamber had wooden gallery benches that seated 100, and along the far wall there were additional folding chairs that city staff set out when attendance warranted. On a normal council night, the room was perhaps a third full. People came when something touched them directly. Most zoning matters drew the interested parties and a thin ring of general-purpose observers who followed local government the way others followed weather. Tonight was not a normal council night. Every bench in the gallery was full. The folding chairs along the wall were full. People were standing along the sides, 2 and 3 deep, in places in the particular posture of citizens who have made a decision to be present and have arrived prepared to wait as long as the process requires. The overflow extended into the hallway outside the chamber doors, where the building's intercom system carried the session for those who could not find standing room inside. 150 people, more or less. Some had come from the east side neighborhoods directly. Some had come from other parts of Millbrook because they had been asked to come, or because they understood that what happened to one neighborhood's standing with the city council had a way of eventually reaching into other neighborhoods too. Some had come because Reverend Solomon Augustine Pryce had asked them to, not in a speech and not with pressure, but in the way he asked things directly, in conversation with the specific quality of a man who believes that presence matters and that showing up is not a small act but a deliberate one, a statement that something is worth the trouble of being in a room for. The zoning proposal on the agenda was identified in city documents as Zoning Amendment Case 2024-114. A rezoning request affecting approximately 18 parcels on the east side of Millbrook in and around the blocks where Bethel Community Church sat on the corner of Aldrich Street and 4th Avenue. The proposed reclassification would have changed the area from residential mixed use to commercial mixed use, a change that was modest in appearance on a zoning map and significant in practice on a lived street. Commercial mixed use permitted building heights and density configurations that residential mixed use did not. It permitted uses that would change the character of blocks that had been residential in fact and in character for over 60 years. It would have made the existing church's institutional zoning status more complicated to maintain. And it would have, in the specific calculus of property development and neighborhood displacement that had played out in similar amendments in similar cities over the preceding 2 decades, accelerated the departure of the families who had lived in those blocks for generations. Reverend Pryce understood this. He had not come to this understanding quickly or from a single source. He had spent 4 weeks studying it. He had obtained the relevant zoning ordinances from the city's planning department and read them with care. He had reviewed the city's own neighborhood impact assessment, which had been filed with the amendment application and which he believed was incomplete in its analysis of displacement risk. He had consulted with 2 people he trusted who had specific knowledge of municipal planning processes. One was a retired city planner from a larger municipality who attended Bethel Church and had offered his time without being asked. And the other was a professor of urban planning at the State University who had reviewed the amendment documentation and written a detailed letter that Reverend Pryce intended to submit to the record. He had gathered data. He had cross-referenced the city's own ordinance language against the amendment's stated justifications and found places where the justifications did not hold under examination. And he had gathered names. The petition had been 4 weeks in the making. He had begun it not by circulating a clipboard at church, though that came later, but by walking. Block by block, door by door in the evenings, and on Saturday mornings across the east side neighborhoods that the amendment would affect. He had knocked on doors he had knocked on for 31 years in the course of pastoral work to visit the sick, to check on the elderly, to bring meals, to be present in the particular way a neighborhood pastor is present, not by appointment, but by proximity. He knew these streets the way a person knows the streets they have walked in all weathers and at all hours for 3 decades. He knew which houses had new families, and which had families that had been there since the 1970s. He knew the names of the children who played in the yards and the names of the grandmothers who watched them from the porches. He had not treated these visits as transactions. He had sat down at kitchen tables. He had drunk coffee he did not always want. He had listened to what people said about the neighborhood, about what it had been and what they hoped it would remain, and he had answered their questions about the amendment as plainly and completely as he could. 340 people had signed. Not all of them were church members. A number of them attended other churches or no church at all. What they shared was an address in the affected area and a view about what should happen to the place they lived. Reverend Pryce had assembled their signatures in a bound document, a blue folder, the kind sold in office supply stores with a clear plastic cover through which the first page of the petition was visible. The first page listed the case number, the date, and the formal petition heading in simple type. The pages behind it held 340 names each with a printed address verifying residents in the affected area, each signed by hand. He had counted them twice. He had verified that every address fell within the amendment's impact zone. He had carried the folder with him on the drive to the council chamber as he had carried his notes, his ordinance references, and the letter from the university professor in a leather briefcase that had been a gift from the congregation on his 20th anniversary at Bethel. He had been a member of the Millbrook Neighborhood Advisory Council for 18 years. The Advisory Council was a formal body established by the city to ensure that neighborhood representatives had a structured channel of input into city planning decisions. It had 12 members serving staggered 3-year terms. Its recommendations were advisory in nature, not binding, but they were entered into the formal record of any proceeding to which they related, and they carried weight, not the weight of a vote, but the weight of documented community perspective offered by people who held accountable positions and had been formally recognized by the city to hold them. Reverend Pryce's seat on that council was not honorary. It was active. He attended every session. He filed written input on proposals affecting his neighborhoods. He had done this for 18 years without interruption through 3 mayoral administrations and 2 full rotations of the city council's membership. Tonight he was here in both capacities as a member of the Advisory Council, which had formally submitted a written objection to Zoning Amendment Case 2024-114 3 weeks prior, and as a citizen of the affected area, exercising his public comment rights during the scheduled public input period. He had signed up for public comment at the city clerk's desk before the session opened. He had been assigned his 3-minute slot, no 5 minutes, because the council chair, Councilmember Walsh, had approved extended comment periods for this session given the volume of sign-ups and the complexity of the subject matter. Each registered speaker this evening had 5 minutes. This had been announced at the start of the session. It was in the written agenda that had been distributed at the chamber entrance. Reverend Pryce knew this. He had the agenda in his briefcase. He had managed his remarks accordingly, fitting what he needed to say into the time available with the care of someone who respects the process enough to work within its structure even when the structure is tight. He was 47th in the sign-up order. He had arrived early and found a seat in the gallery and sat through the preceding speakers with the patient-focused attention that was his natural mode in any room where important things were being decided. He listened to his neighbors speak. He listened to a young woman who had been born in one of the affected blocks and who still lived in her grandmother's house and who spoke about what the neighborhood meant to families who had nowhere else to go if it changed beyond recognition. He listened to a retired school teacher who had looked up the zoning code on his own and found the same ordinance section that Reverend Pryce had identified, and who presented his finding in the plain, emphatic way of a man who wants to make sure the council understands exactly what he found. He listened to a developer's representative, one of three, who were registered to speak, offer a case for the amendment in terms of economic development and tax base expansion, and the benefits of mixed-use commercial density to residential property values. He listened without visible reaction to all of it, because this was not the time for his reaction. His time would come in order. His name was called at 8:47 in the evening. The session had been running for 2 hours and 22 minutes. The chamber was still full. No one had left. The gallery benches held their people with the particular weight of an audience that understands it is watching something that matters. When his name was called, Reverend Pryce rose, set his briefcase on the bench beside him with care, picked up his notes and the blue folder, and walked to the public comment podium at the front of the chamber. He was 63 years old. He had a deliberate way of moving, not slow, not effortful, but considered as if each step was a conscious decision rather than an automatic one. He was a tall man, broad through the shoulders, with a face that people who knew him described as a face that held things, not a face that hid things, a face that had received a great deal of information over a great deal of years and had absorbed it without losing its clarity. He wore a dark suit, a white dress shirt and a tie with a small geometric pattern. He set the blue folder on the surface of the podium and set his notes beside it. He looked at the council members arranged behind the raised dais. He looked at the room. He adjusted the microphone slightly. He began to speak. He gave his name. He identified his role as a member of the Neighborhood Advisory Council. He noted that the Advisory Council had submitted a formal written objection to Zoning Amendment Case 2024-114 on the record 3 weeks prior, and that his remarks tonight would expand on the specific grounds of that objection. He cited the first ordinance section by number and title. He did not read the ordinance language in full. He had it available in his notes, but he had been precise in selecting what needed to be said aloud and what was already in the record. He stated the specific provision that the amendment in his analysis and in the analysis of the urban planning expert, whose letter was being submitted to the record, failed to satisfy. He gave the reasons concisely. He moved to the second point. The second point concerned displacement impact data. He had obtained through a public records request the city's own records of similar zoning reclassifications in Millbrook over the preceding 15 years. He had reviewed the demographic composition of the affected neighborhoods before and after each reclassification using the city's own census tract data. He stated what he found. The numbers were not alarming in isolation. They were alarming in pattern. He presented the pattern without rhetorical inflation. He let the numbers carry what they needed to carry. He moved toward his third point. He had been speaking for approximately 4 minutes. He was composed. He was thorough. He had not raised his voice. He had not deviated from the subject of his objection or introduced material that was not relevant to the amendment under consideration. He had not paused for applause or gestural acknowledgement from the gallery. He had spoken at the measured pace of a man who knows how to fill time productively, and he was 60 seconds from finishing. Officer Claude Renfrew had been standing at the back of the chamber for the duration of the session. He was 34 years old, assigned to provide security at city council meetings as part of the Millbrook Police Department's regular duty rotation. He had been in this room on previous occasions. The protocol was clear. Council meetings were public events in a civic building, and his role was to maintain order should it be disrupted, to respond to disturbances if they occurred, and to be present as a deterrence to the kind of disruption that rarely occurred at city council meetings in a city the size of Millbrook. He was not a sergeant. He was not a supervisor. He had no authority over the council's proceedings. He had no authority over the podium or the comment period. He had no authority to determine when a speaker's time was up. Renfrew had been on the force for 9 years. He had come to the Millbrook Police Department from a smaller department in a neighboring county, transferring at 26 when a position opened with better pay and better hours. He was regarded as a competent officer in the specific ways the department measured competence. His reports were filed on time. His use of force incidents were within departmental norms. He had no sustained complaints in his personnel file. He had attended the department's community relations training twice, once at orientation and once at the mandatory 3-year renewal. He had absorbed the training in the way that people absorb training they regard as formal requirement, rather than substantive instruction attending, completing, receiving the certificate, and returning to the daily work without revision. He was not a man who examined his own assumptions at length. He was a man of practical orientation who preferred situations that resolved cleanly, and who had developed over 9 years a strong preference for being the person in any given room who determined how resolution happened. The council security assignment was considered a routine posting. Most officers did not find it particularly interesting. Renfrew had accepted it with the indifference of someone filling a rotation. He had been in the chamber enough times to feel at ease in it, which meant he had been there enough times to feel ownership of a space that was not his to own. He knew the layout. He knew the staff. He had opinions about the efficiency of the proceedings that he had shared with colleagues, and that amounted in their totality to the view that council meetings ran long because people were allowed to say too much without adequate direction. He had never expressed this view to anyone in a position of actual authority over the meetings. It lived in the background of his posture in the room, in the way he leaned against the wall at the back of the chamber and watched the proceedings with the particular patience of someone who believes that patience is something he is graciously extending to a process that is not sufficiently organized to deserve it. He had been watching Reverend Pryce since the Reverend began to speak. He had been watching with the quality of attention that is not interested in what is being said, but in how long it is being said and what effect it seems to be having on the room. He was reading something in the room that was not what was actually in the room. The room was attentive. The room was listening. The gallery was still in the way that a room becomes still when it is fully engaged. This was not tension. This was the opposite of tension. This was 150 people who had come to hear their neighbor speak and were hearing him speak and were finding the experience of being represented in a formal proceeding by someone who knew the subject and had done the work to be precisely what they had come for. Renfrew did not read it this way. He read the stillness as something charged the attention, as something that needed management, the sustained engagement of the room with the speaker as a sign that the situation was developing a weight that he should counterbalance. This reading was wrong. It was wrong in the specific way that authority exercised without understanding is always wrong. Not through malice necessarily, but through the substitution of pattern recognition for actual perception, the replacement of what is in front of you with what you have decided should be in front of you. He began walking from the back of the chamber toward the front. He moved along the side wall, past the ends of the gallery benches in the unhurried walk of someone who believes he is performing a reasonable action. Some of the people in the gallery saw him moving and registered it with the specific alertness of people who have learned to notice when someone in authority is about to do something that does not make sense in context. They watched. They did not intervene because there was nothing yet to intervene in, and because the meeting was still in session and the speaker was still speaking, and everything was still proceeding as it should. Renfrew reached the front of the chamber. He stepped close to the podium. He stood just behind Reverend Pryce's left shoulder. He said in a voice low enough to be discreet but audible to the front rows of the gallery and to the council members behind the dais, "Sir, your time is up. You need to step back from the podium." Reverend Pryce did not look away from the council. He continued his sentence to its end. Then he said quietly, without turning, "I have 1 minute remaining in my allotted time." Renfrew said, "The chair has signaled me." Councilmember Diane Walsh, sitting at the center of the raised dais in the chair's position she had held for 4 years, had not signaled him. She had her hands folded on the dais surface in front of her. She had been watching Reverend Pryce with the focused expression of someone receiving information she is going to need later. She had not signaled anyone anything. Diane Walsh was 61 years old and had served on the Millbrook City Council for 11 years, the last 4 as chair. She had grown up in Millbrook, in a different part of the city from the east side, the north side, where her father had owned a hardware store for 30 years, and had come to local government through the school board where she had served for 6 years before running for council. She was not an ideologue. She was a process person, which meant she believed in the procedural architecture of public governance with a conviction that bordered on the religious: the agenda, the record, the rules of order, the formal recognition of speakers, and the specific protections those recognitions carried. She had made enemies on the council over her tenure by enforcing procedural rules against colleagues who found them inconvenient, and she had made allies by enforcing the same rules against the colleagues' opponents when the situation was reversed. The rules did not have favorites. This was the point of them. She had enforced them without favoritism for 11 years and intended to continue doing so. She had known Reverend Pryce for 14 of those years. Not intimately, they were not social friends and did not move in the same circles outside of civic contexts. But she knew him in the way that people who have been in the same rooms doing the same work for a long time know each other through accumulation, through observation, through the specific credibility that builds when a person shows up prepared and reliable year after year in the shared enterprise of figuring out how a city should be governed. She respected him. She would have respected him equally if she had never met him before tonight, because what she was watching from the dais was a man who had done his homework, organized his community, and was using the procedural machinery of public governance for exactly the purpose for which it was designed. This was what she believed government was for. When she watched it working, she paid attention. The council chamber had gone quiet in the particular way that rooms go quiet when everyone in them has just understood that something wrong is happening. Reverend Pryce said I was not advised my time had been reduced. Renfrew put his hand on Reverend Pryce's arm. Not a grip. A firm, directional pressure. The physical language of a man steering another man away from a place communicating through contact, what he had been unable to communicate through words, asserting through his hand. A fact about who had authority in this moment that had nothing to do with the clock on the chamber wall or the agenda distributed at the door or the 18 years of formal advisory council membership or the 340 names in the blue folder on the podium surface. Reverend Pryce looked down at the hand on his arm. He looked at it for the briefest moment. He looked back at the council. Then he stepped back from the podium. He did this without a word, without a gesture toward the room, without any display that could be interpreted as escalation. He stepped back with the particular kind of dignity that costs something to maintain, the kind that requires a man to hold himself inside himself, rather than let what he is actually feeling express itself in the forms that would be completely understandable and completely useless in this moment. He was standing in front of the people he had served for 31 years in the building, where the city made its decisions about the neighborhoods those people lived in, having been physically removed from the public comment podium by a police officer 60 seconds before his allotted time expired, and he understood with the comprehensive understanding of a man who has spent 63 years being black in America, and 31 years being the shepherd of a community that carries the history of what that means, exactly what this moment was and what it was not. And he chose without hesitation to be the thing the moment needed him to be, rather than the thing the moment provoked him to be. He stepped back. The blue folder remained on the podium. For a moment, the chamber held the silence of a room that has just received a shock and has not yet had time to decide what to do with it. Councilmember Diane Walsh did not wait for the moment to extend itself further. She leaned forward in the chair's position at the center of the dais and pressed the button of her microphone. She did not raise her voice. She did not express indignation through her tone or her posture. She spoke with the flat, precise clarity of a woman who has decided that the record will reflect exactly what occurred, and that the record will be unambiguous. She said, for the record, I did not signal the officer. The chamber was entirely still. She said, Reverend Pryce has time remaining at the podium. She looked at Reverend Pryce, who was standing a step back from the lectern. She said, Reverend Pryce, please return to the podium and complete your remarks. Renfrew had moved to the side of the podium. He stood there for a moment in the specific way of a man who has just realized that the ground he thought he was standing on is not what he believed it to be, but who has not yet determined what the appropriate response to this realization is. Councilmember Walsh looked at him. She said, "Officer, please return to your post." Her voice contained no theater. It contained no performative emphasis. It was the voice of a person in a formal position using that position in the precise way it was meant to be used to establish the boundary between what had authority in this room and what did not. Renfrew looked at her for a moment. Then he walked back down the side of the chamber to the position he had occupied at the start of the session. Reverend Pryce walked back to the podium. He did not look at the gallery. He did not acknowledge what had just occurred. He did not pause to receive the moment or allow the moment to become about anything other than what it was supposed to be about, which was the zoning amendment, which was the East Side neighborhoods, which was the 340 names in the blue folder that had been waiting for him on the podium surface throughout all of it. He picked up the folder with his left hand and found his place in his notes with his right, and he began to speak again at exactly the measured pace at which he had been speaking before, with exactly the same quality of tone, as if there had been no interruption at all. He moved to the third point of his objection. He had 58 seconds. He used them completely. He summarized the third point. He cited the specific section of the ordinance not by its general name, but by part section and subsection, precisely the way a person cites a document when they want the record to reflect that they read it thoroughly and understood it specifically. He stated the relevant implication of that section for the amendment's stated justification. And then, in the final seconds of his remaining time, he looked up from his notes and looked at the council and said that he wanted to acknowledge the 340 residents of the East Side neighborhoods whose names were in the petition he was submitting to the record. He said that they had given their time to sign a document that represented their considered view of what should happen to the place where they lived. He said that the petition was being submitted in conjunction with his remarks. He set it on the edge of the dais without comment. He did not mention what had occurred at the podium. He did not need to. He stepped back from the microphone and walked back to his seat in the gallery, and the room released the breath it had been holding since the moment his arm had been touched, and the sound that came through the gallery was not applause exactly, though applause is what some people would have called it. It was the sound of a room confirming something, affirming a fact. Not celebrating it because what had happened was not a thing to celebrate, but recognizing it, placing it in the record of the evening alongside everything else that had been said and done in this room tonight, making it permanent in the way that witnessed things become permanent. Councilmember Walsh called for a brief recess. She said it in the tone of a person who has something to accomplish that requires a pause in proceedings. The gavel came down with a single clean sound, and the council members rose from behind the dais, and the gallery murmured and stretched, and some people went into the hallway, and some stayed in their seats, and the city staff moved around the edges of the room with the purposeful efficiency of people who understand when something significant has just shifted in the formal proceedings they support. During the recess, Councilmember Walsh spoke with 3 other members of the council. She spoke with them in a cluster near the side door to the council anteroom, not in private exactly, but in the particular configuration of a small group having a deliberate conversation that is not intended for public address, but is not concealed from it either. A 5th person joined them, the city's police liaison officer, Lieutenant Carolyn Eccles, who had been seated in the staff section of the chamber, and who responded to the council members' eye contact with the immediate readiness of someone who had seen what the room had seen and had been waiting to be asked. The conversation lasted approximately 8 minutes. It was not heated. It was professional and specific and brief as conversations are when the parties involved have all observed the same event from positions close enough to it that ambiguity is not a viable option. Lieutenant Eccles took notes on a small notepad she carried in the breast pocket of her uniform jacket. Councilmember Walsh spoke with the precision she had used at the microphone. The other 3 council members said what they had observed. Lieutenant Eccles said what she would do with the information and in what time frame. The formal complaint was filed that night. When the recess ended and the council returned to its positions behind the dais, the chamber reorganized itself into the attentive, weighted stillness it had held before the break. Reverend Pryce was in his seat in the gallery. He had used the recess to review his notes and drink from the water bottle he had brought in his briefcase. He did not speak to the people around him during the recess about what had happened. The people around him did not ask him about it. They were there for the meeting. The meeting was still happening. That was where the attention needed to go. The remaining public comment speakers were heard. There were 11 of them following Reverend Pryce in the sign-up order, and each was given their time, and each spoke without incident. The tenor of the room through these final speakers was different from what it had been in the first 2 hours of the session. Not louder, not more agitated, but more deliberate, as if each speaker was aware that they were contributing to something that had taken on a specific gravity, and that the quality of their contribution mattered to the shape of what would remain in the record. Several speakers who came after Reverend Pryce cited the same ordinance section he had cited. 2 speakers explicitly referenced the petition. One woman who had signed the petition, a third-grade teacher who lived 2 blocks from Bethel Church, said without reference to the earlier incident that she wanted the council to understand that the 340 people who had signed the petition were not an abstraction. They were people with addresses and children and mortgage payments and a specific understanding of what their neighborhood was and what it would cease to be if the zoning was changed. She said she hoped the council would look at the names when it reviewed the petition. She said they are all there. The public comment period closed at 10:15 in the evening. The council proceeded to deliberation. The deliberation was not perfunctory. The council members asked questions of the city's planning staff who had prepared the amendment documentation. They asked about the displacement impact data that Reverend Pryce and other speakers had cited. The planning director, a careful and experienced woman named Sandra Yee, answered directly, including a candid acknowledgement that the impact assessment that had accompanied the amendment application had used a conservative methodology in its displacement projections, and that the data presented in the public comments tonight represented a valid and substantively different analysis of the same underlying numbers. She said this without hedging. It was the answer of someone who had heard what was said tonight and understood that the record demanded honesty. Councilmember Walsh said when it was her turn to address her colleagues during deliberation that she wanted to be direct about the petition. She said that 340 names representing residents of a specific geographic area who had been individually solicited and had individually signed a formal document constituted one of the clearest expressions of neighborhood intent she had encountered in her 4 years on the council. She said the petition would be entered in full into the formal record of Case 2024-114. She said she wanted it there not only as an exhibit, but as documentation of the fact that the affected community had been actively engaged, not passively consulted. There is a difference, she said. There is a significant difference. She did not mention the incident at the podium during deliberation. She had said what needed to be said about it on the record during the session before the recess. The record held it. What was needed now was the vote. The vote came at 10:53. The council voted 5-2 to reject zoning amendment case 2024-114. The 2 votes in favor of the amendment were cast by council members Peter Halloran and Joyce Brewer, both of whom had stated during deliberation that they believed the economic development rationale for the amendment outweighed the displacement concerns, and both of whom had spent the evening's deliberation period in the particular visible discomfort of people who know they are going to be on the losing side of something and have decided to be on it anyway. The 5 votes against the amendment were cast by Councilmember Walsh, Councilmember Marcus Tillman of the 4th District, Councilmember Anita Osei, Councilmember Robert Schaller, and Councilmember David Fong. In the formal record of the vote, which would be published in the City Council minutes within 3 business days, the rejection citation included specific reference to the testimony of the Neighborhood Advisory Council representative and to the community petition submitted with 340 resident signatures. It also cited the specific ordinance section by part section and subsection, which Reverend Pryce had given in the final 58 seconds of his allotted time. When the vote was announced, the chamber responded with the sound of a long exhale. Not cheering, not celebration. The sound of people who had been carrying something for a while and had just been told they could set it down. Several people in the gallery were crying quietly with the particular restraint of people who did not want to be conspicuous about something that was simply true. The third-grade teacher who had spoken near the end of the comment period had her hand over her mouth. Reverend Pryce was sitting in his seat with his hands folded in his lap. He was looking at the dais. His expression was the expression of a man receiving confirmation of something he had worked toward and believed in, but had not allowed himself to count on until it was official. He sat in that position until the gavel came down on the close of the session. Then he bent and opened his briefcase and placed his notes inside it carefully. He closed the briefcase. He rose from the bench. Several people around him reached out a hand on the arm, a shoulder, a brief embrace from a woman he had known since she was a child in the church's Sunday school program 25 years ago. He received these without hurry, without deflection, with the attentiveness of a man who understands that the people in front of him matter more than his own next task. He took his time. The chamber emptied slowly around him. Diane Walsh was one of the last council members to leave the dais. She gathered her materials with the methodical thoroughness of someone who never leaves anything behind. When she had everything, she looked out across the emptying chamber and found Reverend Pryce still standing near his row in the gallery. Their eyes met across the room. She held his gaze for a moment. She gave him a single nod, not performative, not elaborate, just an acknowledgement. The acknowledgement of one person to another that something had been done that needed doing, and that both of them understood what it had cost. He nodded back. Then she walked out of the chamber. Reverend Solomon Augustine Pryce had been born in 1961 in Millbrook in the brick house on Dunmore Street where his mother's family had lived since 1943. He had grown up 2 blocks from where Bethel Community Church now stood in a neighborhood that was in the 1960s and 1970s the center of the East Side's civic and religious life. The neighborhood whose vitality was expressed in its Saturday commerce and its Sunday mornings and its school board meetings and its block association minutes. All of it accumulated layer by layer into the dense and specific knowledge that belongs to people who have never needed to decide that a place is theirs because the question was settled before they were born. People sometimes asked him, though less frequently as the years passed and his presence became simply part of the landscape of the East Side, how he had ended up at Bethel. The question usually implied a more dramatic answer than he had to give. They expected a calling story with a clear moment of revelation, the kind of story that has a before and an after and a specific transformative event in the middle. He did not have that story. He had a different kind of story, which was the story of a slow and honest reckoning with what he was actually good at, and what he was actually needed for, arrived at through years of paying attention to both. He had not been a certain thing to become a minister. He had been the kind of young man who contains several possible futures and follows the one that presents itself with the most force when the time comes to choose. He had studied religion and philosophy at a historically black university in the state, had graduated in 1984, had spent 2 years working at a community development nonprofit before feeling the pull toward the pastoral that he had been aware of and careful about since his early 20s. He had been ordained at 28. He had arrived at Bethel Community Church at 32, following a pastor who had served there for 27 years, and whose departure had left the congregation not bereft, but waiting with the patience of a community that has been waiting for things for a long time and has developed a corresponding capacity for recognizing what it has been waiting for when it arrives. He had arrived. He had stayed. 31 years is a long time to be in one place in one role with the same people in various configurations as they moved through the stages that brought them to him. Baptism, confirmation, marriage, illness, death. the counseling of people in crisis, and the celebration of people in good fortune, and the steady, unremarkable accompaniment of people in the ordinary middle of their lives, which is where most of life actually occurs. He had sat with people in hospitals in the hours before they died, and he had stood at the back of churches at the reception lines, following weddings of people he had watched grow up, and he had been called at 2 a.m. by people whose marriages were ending, and people whose children were in trouble, and people who had simply in the middle of the night found themselves unable to carry what they were carrying without hearing a familiar voice. This was the pastoral work. It did not end. It did not become routine. Every situation was its own situation. Every person who came to him came with the specific and irreducible weight of their own particular life. And what he brought to that weight was not a method or a system, but a quality of attention that had been developed over 31 years of practice and that could not be acquired any other way. He was good at it in the way that people are good at things they have done for a long time with genuine engagement. Not perfect, not without error or limitation, but genuinely useful to the people who needed it. That was what he asked of himself, to be genuinely useful. Not impressive, not historic, useful. The Neighborhood Advisory Council had been for him a natural extension of what the pastoral work already required. He had joined at 45 not as an act of civic ambition, but because the neighborhoods where his congregation lived were being shaped by decisions being made in rooms he was not in, and he was not prepared to continue watching that happen without being in the rooms. He had learned the process. He had learned which documents to request and how to read them, and which provisions of the ordinance code actually governed the decisions that affected his neighborhoods, and how to connect the language of those provisions to the specific circumstances of specific streets. He had learned when to speak and when to submit written comments, and when the most useful thing he could do was appear in person so that the people making decisions would have to look at a face that represented the people about whom they were deciding. He had used all of these tools over 18 years. He used them carefully, and with the understanding that they were tools, not magic, that their effectiveness depended on the quality of the work behind them, and the consistency of the engagement, and the relationships built over years of showing up in the same rooms, and being reliable and prepared. The night of the zoning vote was not the first time he had prevailed in a council proceeding. It was not even the most consequential matter he had brought to the advisory council in 18 years. There had been a proposed highway rerouting in 2014 that would have taken 3 residential blocks. There had been a school consolidation proposal in 2018 that had been defeated in significant part on the basis of community impact data he had assembled and presented. There had been smaller matters that did not make the news but mattered intensely to the families involved. Variances, permits assessments that had been contested and overturned or modified or referred back for additional review. He had been in this work for a long time. He did not require the work to be dramatic in order to do it. What had been dramatic tonight was not something he had sought and not something he was particularly interested in dwelling on. He was standing in this parking lot of the city building at 11:20 in the evening in the cool autumn air with his briefcase, having said goodbye to the last of the people who had wanted to speak with him before he got to his car. The lot was mostly empty now. A few people were still in conversation in small groups near their vehicles. The building's exterior lights were on against the dark, casting the cream facade into a bright relief against the sky. He was thinking about what he would say on Sunday. The thought had been with him through the ride home and into the house and through the hour he had spent sitting at his kitchen table before going to bed. He preached twice on Sundays, the 8 o'clock service, and the 11 o'clock with a Bible study hour in between for the adults and a children's program that ran concurrently. He had a text he was working with for the upcoming Sunday, which had nothing to do with what had happened tonight, and he had been in the middle of his preparation notes when the week's intensity had pulled his attention elsewhere. He would need to return to them tomorrow. He was thinking about a particular verse in that passage and whether it led where he wanted the sermon to go and whether the direction he had planned was actually the right direction, or whether tonight's events were suggesting something adjacent to it that he had not considered before. This was how his mind worked when it was processing. It moved sideways into the work, using the work as a way of understanding the experience rather than examining the experience directly. He had learned not to fight this. It was how he prepared, and preparation was the thing that kept the pastoral work from becoming merely reactive, from becoming a long series of responses without the through line of considered understanding that distinguished response from wisdom. He unlocked his car. He set his briefcase on the passenger seat. He sat for a moment before starting the engine. The blue folder was in his briefcase. The petition had been submitted to the council's record as planned. He had 340 names in that record, and those names would remain there attached to the formal vote in perpetuity, or in whatever perpetuity applied to the physical and digital records of a mid-sized American city's planning proceedings, which was long enough to matter. He started the car and drove home. In the days that followed the council meeting, the city of Millbrook continued its ordinary municipal operations. Permits were filed. Assessments were processed. The Public Works Department repaired a section of storm drain on the north end of 4th Avenue that had been flagged for 3 months. The city did not pause. The city's operations did not register the council session as anything other than a council session that had produced a vote. The processes continued. In this, the city was correct. The processes were the point. But in the East Side neighborhoods and in Bethel Community Church, and in the conversations that circulated through Millbrook in the days following the session, was not yet finished being processed. People had been in that room. People had watched something happen that required time to understand, not the zoning vote which had a clear outcome, but the other thing, the thing that had occurred at the podium and been corrected at the podium, and had continued after its correction as though it had not occurred. That continuity was itself part of what needed to be processed. The fact that Reverend Pryce had returned to the podium and used 58 seconds to address a point about an ordinance subsection was not a neutral act. It was a demonstration of something. The neighborhood was working out what the demonstration meant. The formal complaint against Officer Claude Renfrew was processed through the Millbrook Police Department's Internal Affairs Division beginning the following morning. Lieutenant Carolyn Eccles submitted her documentation within 12 hours of the session's close. The complaint was classified as a conduct matter under the department's community relations policy, which governed officer behavior at public civic events and specified the protocols for deployment at council sessions, public hearings, and city-sponsored community meetings. The classification was not ambiguous. The policy language was specific, and the behavior described in the complaint fell within its prohibitions. The review took 11 days. The council session recording was reviewed as part of the investigation. The recording had captured everything. The audio was clear, and the chamber's fixed security camera had captured the visual sequence from a position that left nothing uncertain about what had occurred. The camera showed Reverend Pryce at the podium. It showed Renfrew's approach from the rear. It showed the contact. It showed the council chair on the dais, hands folded, having given no signal of any kind. It showed Reverend Pryce's step back. It showed the folder remaining on the podium. It showed Councilmember Walsh's response. It showed all of it in the plain visual language of a recorded event that did not require interpretation, only viewing. Renfrew was interviewed twice during the review. He maintained in the first interview that he had observed signs of rising tension in the chamber and had made a judgment call about de-escalation. He said he had not intended to interfere with the speaker's time, but had believed, based on the chair's posture, that she was ready to conclude the public comment section. He was shown the recording. After viewing it, he was asked whether he wished to revise his account. He said he understood that his reading of the chair's posture had been incorrect. The reviewing officer noted in the formal report that the incident had occurred in a public proceeding that was being recorded, that the council chair had made a real-time public correction of the officer's stated justification on the session record, and that the correction was available in the permanent minutes of the council session for public review. The reviewing officer further noted that the specific moment of physical contact had been observed by approximately 150 community members and all 7 council members present, and that no person in that room had indicated uncertainty about what they had witnessed. The formal reprimand was issued on the 13th day following the incident. It cited 3 policy violations: unauthorized intervention in a city council public proceeding, physical contact with a member of the public without legal basis, and provision of an inaccurate account of the triggering circumstances in an initial interview. The reprimand was entered in Renfrew's personnel file, where it would remain for purposes of any future conduct review. He was removed from city council security assignments indefinitely. He was not suspended and was not terminated. The Internal Affairs report noted that his record prior to the incident contained no previous formal reprimands, and that the department's discipline guidelines applied consistently did not support termination for a first documented conduct violation. This decision was noted in the report without elaboration. The department did not offer public comment on the matter of ongoing employment beyond what the formal statement contained. The Millbrook Police Department issued a public apology 9 days after the incident, 3 days before the formal reprimand was issued. The statement was posted on the department's website and distributed to local media. It stated that the department had reviewed the circumstances of the October council session and had determined that the conduct of the officer assigned to the chamber did not reflect the department's standards or its commitment to supporting the rights of community members to participate fully in public proceedings. It stated that this commitment was not conditional on the race of the participant or the content of the speech. It offered apologies to Reverend Pryce specifically by name and to the community members who had witnessed the incident. It stated that the matter had been addressed through the department's internal processes, and that those processes were ongoing. The statement did not use the words profiling or bias. It did not characterize the officer's motivations. It confined itself to what could be stated as fact, what had occurred, what the standard should have been, and the fact that the 2 things did not correspond. This was a narrow statement. People who read it understood that its narrowness was itself a statement about how far the department was willing to go in naming the thing that had occurred. People who had been in the chamber that night, and people who knew Reverend Pryce, and people who understood what it meant for a 63-year-old black pastor to be physically steered from a podium during a public proceeding in a city where he had served for 31 years, had their own understanding of the full dimensions of what the statement did not say. Reverend Pryce received the public apology privately before it was released in a meeting at the chief's office with Chief Margaret Delacroix, who had been in her position for 3 years, and who met with him without intermediaries and without a public relations officer in the room. She had requested the meeting. He had accepted it. The meeting lasted 40 minutes. Neither party disclosed its full contents afterward. Reverend Pryce said in the brief comment he offered to a local reporter who asked him about it, "I appreciate that the meeting happened." He said nothing else on the subject. He did not file a civil lawsuit. He did not call a press conference. He did not contact national media. He did not make the incident the center of his public communication in the weeks following. Some people in his congregation and in the broader community would have supported him in any of those choices, and some of them told him so. He listened to what they said. He told them that he had come to the council meeting to present an objection to a zoning amendment on behalf of 340 residents of the East Side. He said that the council had voted to reject the amendment, and that the petition was in the formal record. He said that the complaint against the officer had been filed and was being processed, and that the outcome had been appropriate. He said, "We did what we came to do." He said this without diminishing what had occurred. He was not in the habit of diminishing things. He was in the habit of knowing what the center of something was and keeping his attention on it. And the center of this particular something had always been the zoning amendment and the neighborhoods it would have changed. That was what the petition was for. That was what the months of preparation were for. That was what 18 years on the Neighborhood Advisory Council and 31 years at Bethel Community Church were for, not for moments of conflict, but for the capacity to be useful in moments that mattered, including the conflicts that arose in the course of trying to be useful. He had been useful, the record said so. Local media covered the story in the days following the council vote. The council session recording was posted to the city's public portal within 48 hours of the meeting's conclusion, as was standard practice. In the 3 days following the vote, the recording received more than 4,000 individual views, which was by the city's own historical metrics for council session recordings approximately 12 times the usual viewership for a comparable land use session. The views came from Millbrook addresses and from addresses elsewhere in the state, and from addresses further out than that, in the way that recordings of events travel when people share them in the context of meaning. This happened, watch this, you should see this. The clip of Councilmember Walsh's correction circulated on its own, extracted from the full session. The clip was 42 seconds long, from the moment of Walsh's first sentence to the moment Renfrew walked back to his post. 42 seconds. Some things compress. The Millbrook Gazette ran a front-page report on the zoning vote that included a section describing the incident at the podium and Councilmember Walsh's on-record correction. The story was picked up by the regional newspaper and by 2 regional television stations whose coverage focused primarily on the community mobilization aspect, the large turnout, the petition numbers, the successful challenge to the amendment. The incident at the podium was covered as part of the larger context, not as the dominant frame of the story. This framing was in various ways both accurate and incomplete, as most framings of complex events are. It captured the civic outcome correctly. It could not fully capture what the room had held in the moment when a man of 31 years of service stepped back from a podium 60 seconds before his time expired. One of the reporters who covered the story for the Gazette was a young woman named Claire Oduya, who had been in the chamber that night as a member of the public before she drove to the newsroom and became a reporter covering the council session. She had signed the petition 4 weeks earlier. Her address was in the affected area. She had moved into the neighborhood 18 months prior. She disclosed this in her coverage. Her account of the evening in the published piece included a paragraph that would be referenced in subsequent reporting on the council session. She wrote without metaphor and without embellishment that the meeting would be remembered as the night the community came to the podium. This was not a description she had planned or reached for. It was the description that arrived when she wrote the sentence, which is how the most accurate descriptions arrive, not from construction, but from recognition. She had been in the room. She had seen what 150 people had come to say and the specific quality of attention with which the council had received it. She had seen a man return to a podium, pick up a blue folder, and use 58 seconds to finish a point about an ordinance section and acknowledge 340 names. She had recognized what she was watching when she was watching it. The description had been available to her because it was true. The phrase moved through the community in the weeks following, mentioned in sermons and in meetings and in conversations at kitchen tables in the East Side neighborhoods where Bethel Church sat. It was not the phrase that mattered. What mattered was what it named, and what it named was a fact about the people who had shown up, and what their showing up had accomplished. The phrase was a way of holding that fact in a form that could be shared, and it was shared, and it persisted. Reverend Pryce was at the church on Saturday morning 2 days after the vote when Marta Collins came to drop off a pan of food for the elderly assistance program that the church ran on the first and third Saturdays of each month. Marta Collins was 71 years old, had been a member of Bethel since 1979, and had been on the East Side since 1971. She had signed the petition in the 3rd week of its circulation, sitting at her kitchen table with Reverend Pryce across from her, and a cup of coffee he had accepted and drunk because it was offered with the expectation that it would be drunk. She had been at the council meeting, seated 3 rows behind him in the gallery. She had watched everything. She set the pan on the reception table and told him she had something to say. He said he was listening, She said, "I want you to know that what you did on Tuesday night is going to be talked about in this neighborhood for a long time." She said not what that officer did, what you did. She said how you came back to that podium and finished your remarks. She said that is the thing people are going to remember. He thanked her. He said he had done what the situation called for. She looked at him for a moment with the particular look of a 71-year-old woman who has known a man for over 2 decades and who is not going to let him be modest about something that is not modesty's territory. She said, "Solomon, what the situation called for was not what you gave it. What the situation called for was a response. What you gave it was a lesson." He accepted this. He said he appreciated it. He said, "Come by Sunday if you can. I'm preaching something I think you'll want to hear." She said she would be there for both services. He held the door open for her as she left. He stood in the doorway for a moment after her car had pulled out of the lot looking at the street. The October light was the same kind of light it was every year, at this time longer, more angular, with the particular quality of afternoon in a season that is becoming something else, the light of things in transition. He stood in it for a moment. Then he went back inside. On the Sunday following the vote, he preached the sermon he had been preparing since before the council meeting on the text he had chosen weeks earlier, which concerned the way justice operates. Not as an event, but as a direction, not a single moment that corrects the balance and then is done, but an ongoing orientation, a way of moving through the world that does not depend on confirmation or victory for its continuation, that proceeds regardless of whether the specific outcome of a specific evening goes the way it should. He preached about the difference between the work and its results, and the way the work is primary and the results are secondary because the results are not fully in anyone's control, but the work always is. He preached about the 340 names as an example of what it looks like when people exercise the control they have when they put their name on a piece of paper that says, "This is where I live and this is what I want for it, and here is my signature as evidence that I am willing to be counted on the record." He did not preach about the council meeting directly. He did not name Officer Renfrew. He did not describe the moment at the podium. He did not need to. Everyone in the room knew what night he was speaking around. The sermon was not the story. The sermon was what the story meant, which is a different thing and which is what a sermon is for. He preached both services. In the 11 o'clock service, Marta Collins was in her regular seat. He found her in the congregation during the sermon and spoke a passage toward her row without identifying her because she would know, and that was sufficient. After the service, people gathered in the fellowship hall with the energy that follows a service when the sermon has connected the room to something it was already carrying. He moved through the room as he always moved through the room after service, unhurried, present, receiving people's words and responding to them with the quality of attention that he had spent 31 years developing. And that was, in the end, not a skill so much as a practice, a way of being present that required its practitioner to be actually present rather than merely performing presence. He was actually present. He had always been. The blue folder was in the council's formal record. The 340 names were part of the official documentation of the rejected zoning amendment. They would remain there attached to the case number and the vote count and the council minutes of that October session in the city's files for as long as the city maintained its files. The folder itself was in his briefcase, which was in his office at the church. He had not made a display of it or placed it anywhere symbolic. He had put it in his briefcase because it was a document, and the briefcase was where he kept documents he might need to reference again. This was not ceremony. It was organization. There were follow-up steps that would unfold over the next several months. The planning department would be required under the ordinance that governed failed amendment applications to conduct a formal neighborhood impact review before any substantially similar amendment could be refiled for a 24-month period. Reverend Pryce had noted this provision in his remarks to the council and had cited it by section. The provision was now in the record alongside the vote. The review, when it was conducted, would involve community input through the Neighborhood Advisory Council. He would be there for that process. He was always there for the process. He did not assume this matter was permanently settled. He had been doing this long enough to know that the things worth protecting require continuous protection. That a vote is a moment in a longer sequence, that a rejected amendment does not eliminate the conditions that produced the application, that the East Side neighborhoods would face future proposals because the pressure that generates such proposals does not relieve itself based on a single council outcome. He was prepared for this. Preparation was the only rational response to a situation that would continue, and it was the preparation that had made the night of the council vote go the way it went. Not the drama of the podium moment, which he had not sought and did not want, but the 4 weeks of petitioning and the 18 years of advisory council work and the 31 years of being present in the East Side in a capacity that allowed 340 people to trust him with their names. He had their names. He had put them in the record. The record held them. The petition remained in the council's formal record, but it had also been duplicated before submission. Reverend Pryce had made a copy of each page organized in the same blue folder format, which he kept at the church. This was his practice with any documentation he submitted to a formal proceeding. He did not do it out of distrust. He did it out of the same principle that governed his sermon preparation and his advisory council work and his pastoral visits. What you do once you do thoroughly, because you cannot know in advance what will matter later, and so you treat everything as if it might. 3 congregation members had called him in the 24 hours following the vote to tell him what they had felt watching the council session. He had listened to each of them. The calls were different in their particulars. One was a man in his 50s who had been in the gallery and who described the moment Renfrew walked toward the podium as something he had felt physically, a coldness that he recognized from earlier experiences in his life and that he had hoped by his 50s he would not have to feel in a city council chamber. Another was a young woman who had been watching the session live stream from her apartment 2 blocks from the church because she could not find childcare for the evening, and who had called not to describe her feelings, but to say, "What did you need from me? What can I do now?" He had appreciated all 3 calls for different reasons. The first reminded him why the work was necessary. The second reminded him that the work was never fully separate from older things that it could not repair. The third reminded him that the people around him were ready to continue, which was always the most useful thing to know. On the Wednesday following the vote, 1 week after the council session, he drove to the home of a woman named Evelyn Traun, who was 82 years old and who had lived in the East Side since 1978, and who had signed the petition in the 4th week of its circulation, 2 days before the council meeting. She had not been at the meeting. She had a health condition that made evening outings difficult, and she had asked her granddaughter to attend in her place and to report back. Her granddaughter had called her from the parking lot after the vote to tell her the result. Evelyn had been awake. She had cried briefly with the particular relief of someone who has been worrying about something for a long time and has just been told it is not, at least for now, going to happen. He visited her as he made his rounds. He sat at her kitchen table where the granddaughter who lived with her served coffee. He answered Evelyn's questions about the proceedings. He described the council chamber and the turnout and the number of speakers and the council's deliberation process. He did not describe the incident at the podium in any detail. He gave it a sentence matter-of-factly and moved on because Evelyn's primary interest was the vote and the petition and what it meant for the neighborhood, and this was also his primary interest, and that was where the conversation stayed. Before he left, Evelyn said, "I want to ask you something." She said, "Were you scared?" He thought about this. He said, "Not in the way you mean." He said, "I was clear." He said, "When you know what you're there for, there isn't room for much else." She said she thought that was the right answer. He said he wasn't sure it was the right answer. He said it was the true one. He drove back to the church in the afternoon light. He had visits to make for the rest of the day, and a meeting that evening with the deacon board on a facilities matter and sermon preparation after that. The week was full in the way his weeks were always full, in the way that the pastoral work fills the weeks of the people who do it, without asking whether the time is available. He had one more thing to do before the day's visits continued. He parked at the church, went inside, went to his office, and sat down at his desk. He opened the desk drawer and took out a piece of church stationery, the standard letterhead with Bethel Community Church across the top and the Aldrich Street address below it, and in the lower left corner, Reverend Solomon A. Pryce, Senior Pastor. He wrote a note. He addressed it to the 340 signatories of the East Side petition care of the church's community bulletin, which was distributed to every household in the affected area that had a bulletin subscription. He wrote 3 paragraphs. He thanked them for their participation. He described the outcome of the vote in plain terms. He told them what came next, the mandatory review period, the follow-up process, the ongoing nature of the work. He ended by saying that their names were in the record, that they had always been in the record, and that this was not a small thing. He was not certain all of them would read it. Some would. Some would hear about it from neighbors or family members who had read it. The point was not that every one of them would see it. The point was that it was sent, that the acknowledgement was made that the 340 people who had trusted him with their names received confirmation that the trust had not been misplaced. This was something he thought about at length in those days, the nature of the trust that had produced the petition. He had been asking people in those 4 weeks of door-knocking to put their name on a public document and attach it to a position. This is not a small thing to ask. Putting your name on a public document is an act of exposure, and some people who might have signed did not sign because they knew what exposure could cost in contexts. They navigated daily at work in their neighborhoods with institutions they depended on. He understood this. He had not pressed anyone. He had explained the petition and what it was for and what it would do, and he had left the decision with the person at the kitchen table. 340 people had decided yes. That yes had a weight that he did not take lightly, and had not taken lightly from the moment he counted the first 100 signatures, and understood that the number was going to mean something when he walked through that council chamber door. He thought about the people who had not signed too, not with judgment, with understanding. The act of staying off a public petition is not necessarily an act of indifference. Sometimes it is an act of survival. He had served long enough to know the difference between the community member who does not sign because they do not care, and the community member who does not sign because they cannot afford the visibility, and he knew that his work served both of them regardless of which one they were. That was the pastoral dimension that the advisory council work required, and that most formal civic processes do not account for the understanding that the people you represent are not homogeneous in their capacity to be counted, and that your job is to carry the weight of all of them, the visible and the invisible, when you walk into a room. This was what the pastoral work required. The closing of the loop, the completion of the obligation, the act of returning to the person who gave you something to say, "I received what you gave me, and here is what I did with it." He folded the letter, put it in an envelope, and addressed it to the church's administrative assistant with a note requesting distribution through the bulletin. He set it in the outgoing mail tray on the corner of his desk. He looked at the tray for a moment. Then he picked up the notes he had been preparing before the council week intervened and turned back to the sermon he was working on for 2 Sundays hence. Subscribe our channel if these are the stories you come here to find. We will keep telling them. Some rooms hold what happens in them longer than others. The Millbrook City Council chamber on that October night became one of those rooms not because of what was taken from the podium, but because of what returned to it.